The series, Parables. We all need to know the parables of Jesus because they were stories, but more than that. In fact, when he would tell a parable, he would always relate it to something that they were familiar with, so he could then teach them something that they were not familiar with yet. But he was cutting edge at the time. He would talk about fig trees or shepherds and sheep, and he would talk about seeds and whatever it was. He could look at a field and get an illustration out of it. He would tell what they were looking at so he could then teach them something they needed to look at. So the most familiar parable in all of the gospel is in the book of Luke. By the way, Luke was not a disciple. I've taught on this before in this series through the book of Luke. He was not a disciple. Luke probably got saved in Antioch, where we were first called Christians, in Paul's missionary journey, that first missionary journey. But Luke wrote a lot of the New Testament more than any other words or any other person. He wrote the most words. He wrote the book of Luke, and he wrote the book of Acts. And so Paul wrote the most books, but Luke was a major hitter. But Luke was a professional person. He was not a disciple. Ultimately, he became a major player. We know that because of what he wrote. And then his heart after God. But he was a doctor, a busy person moving through life. Raise your hand if you're a busy person, all right? So he went out. 51% of the book of Luke is reading. That's all it is. So today, I'm going to talk about this parable related to a father who had two sons. One we call the prodigal son, but really they are both prodigal, and I'm going to prove that to you because they both left the father. One, you may even think that the one who left for a faraway country and squandered everything is the reason why Jesus told it, but it's not necessarily true. And so I'll break that down for you in a minute. I'm not going to speak a long time today, but I do want to let you know that there is a major need right now for men to grow in their relationship with God. But what I'm not going to do is at Mother's Day, a lot of times at church, we'll encourage all the ladies, and then at Father's Day, we'll rip all the men apart. I'm not going to do that. But I am going to challenge the men to grow in their relationship with the Lord, but I also want to challenge the children to give grace to your dad, because there are no perfect fathers. And I could go through so many things that I did wrong as a dad. I could certainly go through a list of things that my dad did wrong, but I like remembering all the things that my dad did right. I remember, though, a few years ago that my dad and I, we were having tension in our relationship. Now, I want to remind you, my dad is like the funniest person to ever live. I could tell you stories like when he was dying, I said, "Dad, do you want to know when you're going to die?" He goes, "No, I don't know. I don't want to know when I'm going to die. I want to know where I'm going to die." And I said, "Why would you want to know that?" He said, "Because I'm never going to go there." That's what he said. He's just crazy. He said, "I took my wife to Hawaii when we married 10 years, and when we married 20 years, I'm going to go and get her." That's my dad. But my dad and I were having tension in our relationship, and I called him. I said, "Dad, I'm going to Baton Rouge. I'm going to be doing a wedding rehearsal on Friday night. On Saturday, I'm going to do a wedding. On Saturday night, I'm speaking at a church, and then Sunday morning as well. But after that, Dad, I'm going to stay a few days later and hang out with you. We can go golfing and all of that." He said, "Okay, son," but I could tell something was wrong with our relationship. Maybe you can tell something is wrong with your relationship with your dad. And maybe as a dad, you can tell that it's with your son or your daughter. Maybe even grandparents need to be thrown into that. Well, the only way to bring resolve to tension in relationships is to talk and to pray with one another. But this doesn't happen much with men. I'm not really sure why. So I knew that my dad was frustrated with me, but I didn't know why, and I never brought it up. My dad had tension with me, and he never brought it up, and I didn't know why. So on that particular weekend, I did just what I said. And after I got through speaking on Sunday, I called my dad because that's what I told him I would do. "Here's my schedule, but I'm calling you on Sunday afternoon." Michelle was with me right next to me in the seat. I called Dad on the phone and said, "Dad, I'm done with everything now. I'm going to come and hang out with you." And he said, "Son, how long have you been in town?" I said, "Dad, well, like I told you, I've been in since Friday when I had that wedding rehearsal and then the wedding." And he goes, "And you're just now calling me?" And I said, well, Dad, I had these things, but I'm calling you now, Dad. I want to be with you now. He said, let me tell you the problem is you don't love me, I'm done. And he hung up the phone. Tension. Michelle was beside me and she goes, wow, that was something. She goes, well, you know what you need to do, don't you? And I said, yeah. What do I need to do? I didn't have a clue. And she goes, you need to go over and talk to him. I said, yeah, that's what I was thinking. So I dropped her off at the hotel and went over and knocked on my dad's door. My dad, he opened the door and looked at me and just left the door open and turned around and went and sat down. Just left me there. So I followed him because I was thinking, what would Michelle tell me to do? So I went and I sat down and I looked at him and said, Dad, what's going on? He said, I'll tell you what's going on. You don't love me. I'm going to tell you, it's painful for a dad not to feel loved. So I knew that I loved him, but I couldn't figure out why he thought I didn't. So I was thinking, what would Michelle say I should say? And then I had this thought, Dad, why do you say I don't love you? He said, I'll tell you why. There's a few reasons. Number one, when we're on the phone and we're talking together, when it's the end of the conversation, you never say, I love you. He said, I'll wait for it. I really want you to say it, but you never say it. And I said, Dad, look, I don't know how much longer you will live or I will live, but I'll never do that again to you. Ever. Because I do love you, Dad. I'm going to say it every time. He goes, good, but there's other things too. I was like, okay, this is going good, going good. He goes, I'm going to tell you something else, is you've never let your kids spend a night over here. And it hurts my feelings. And at that time, I knew I was busted because I never did let my kids spend a night over there because it was the wrong tactic. But my dad got married to a lady who I love, and he has 2 sons, stepsons, and I like them too. But they were teenagers. I didn't know them yet. And as a youth pastor and a pastor, you just don't let your kids spend a night everywhere. But I didn't tell him that. I just came up with excuses. Looking back on it, lies. So son, he would call me on the phone, son, I'm going to take your kids to the zoo, and then they can spend a night with me. Is that a good idea? And I would say, well, Dad, you know, the wind is blowing from the north. And I don't think that's a good idea. And he's like, why? I thought I got away with it for years. But he was keeping track. Dads remember. So I said, Dad, you're right. And then he said, how many times have you let them spend a night with your in-laws? And then I really knew I was in trouble. I said, Dad, I'm sure it's 100 times. He goes, see, you don't love me. I said, Dad, I do. But I didn't want to tell him why. And I couldn't think of what Michelle would say at that time. So I just prayed with him. I asked him, I said, Dad, will you forgive me? Like, I love you. And honestly, we almost cried together. And then we prayed together, and I hugged him, and I left. When I got back to the room, I said, Michelle, this is what happened. She goes, well, you know what you need to do, huh? I said, yeah. What do I need to do? She goes, you need to tell him why they'd never spent the night. And I said, are you sure? And I did the next day when we were playing golf. He goes, oh, you should have told me a long time ago. I wouldn't have been so mad. What's my point? James chapter 5 and verse 16 says, confess your sins to one another. Pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of the righteous person has great power. Raise your hand if you ever made mistakes that you need to confess. Look at this verse. This is the verse to encourage you in Romans. For all, everybody say all. Like it doesn't say in some. But all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. As men, why do we hide mistakes? We've all fallen short. And in the world that we live in, it's such crazy times. Sometimes when I'm watching the news now, I think, man, we've lost our minds. So this morning, I'm going to continue in this parable teaching, but I'm going to go into a simple place. Because very few people in this room can go over the doctrines of the epistles of Romans. Few people in this room can teach us the themes of the book of Hebrews. But a lot of us, we do know this story of the prodigal son, and it starts out with the prodigal son who left, goes to his dad, and he asks the weirdest thing. He's like, "Dad, give me my inheritance now." Which may happen from time to time, but in my recollection, I don't remember that happening with me, a dad, and a son in a room where that was brought up. And I'm sure it happens at times, but it's an unusual request. And I tell you what's even more unusual than that is that the father relented. Because this father knew that he couldn't force his son to stay. I'll tell you the part that had to hurt him the most is that he knew that it was sort of like this. Like in a modern day world, it would be like, "Dad, I've been paying attention to your 401k and looking, you're very good at managing your money. I could see the house is almost paid for. And I'm proud of you for that, Dad, the way you've invested in stocks and even your universal life insurance policy. I looked that up. It's doing really well. So I want my inheritance, Dad, because I'm out of here. I just want to get out of here." And then this son is happy, probably smiling, kisses his dad to leave. Like the pain of that. My daughter Haley, 8 years ago, she left us to go to college at OBU for 4 years. Then she met Luke, who is now a dentist, so that he went to dental school for 4 more years. 8 years she's been gone. I'm proud to say that he's now graduated. He is a dentist, and he got a job right here in Central Arkansas, and they're moving back. Like that. I would have never said, "Hey, let me pay you to leave." I wouldn't pay her to come back. So here's a big question that I've always thought about, and I think this sets up the mode of where I want to go now. Why is it back in the time of Jesus did so many people want to kill Jesus? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, think about it. His primary function was teaching people and healing the sick. So you don't kill the guy who's healing your blind kid. You don't kill the guy who's healing the sick and healing diseases. You don't kill that guy. You may kill the person who's trying to kill that person. So why did they hate Jesus so much? It's all because of Luke chapter 15, where he is speaking these gentle parables at first glance. But what he's really doing is he is bringing, I would say, some sort of he's really deconstructing the world in the way they see it to reconstruct the world the way that they should see it. And a lot of people don't know that. But you're not going to get Luke 15, the prodigal son, if you don't get the first 2 verses that really set the precedent. And this is the most important part of it. It's the first 2 verses. And the reason why I like this is because this is going to be about the audience. You need to know, before you can understand a parable, you need to first go back and look and see who was in the audience. And then you can see the main emphasis that he had. In the audience, you can see now the tax collectors. There's a tax collector there. A tax collector was not similar to the way that you would see a tax collector now. Tax collector now with the IRS, you know what that's all about. But maybe even in your view, back into the day, you may say, well, tax collector is somebody, I think they ripped people off back in those days. Like if you owed $10, they'd go and get $30 and keep 20 and then turn in 10. But a tax collector was way more than that back in those days. Because during that time, the world was ruled by the Romans. From India all the way to England, 5,000 miles. And these people were brutal. So my question is, if you were trying to take over the world and you had that much span of space, how would you govern it? You would have to have a massive military. And then how would you feed them? How would you pay for their salaries? How would you communicate to them? How would you train them? Like if a coup started 1,000 miles away, how would you get over there to take care of this rebellion? Well, you would have to have a very well-trained army that was spread out. So the cost of that was enormous. The problem is that this army, the way that they would rule was through intimidation and also through abuse. Like, it was not uncommon. If you read history, you won't see it in the sacred word of God, but in history you can see that they would pillage a village and they would take people out and murder them. They would hang them on crosses going in and out of the city. They were raping women. They were torturing people. They were starving people. They did all that just to keep fear in the eyes of the people. But how did they fund all of this? Through taxes. And then they had tax collectors. And not only were tax collectors hated, you can imagine the Jewish leaders were sitting right next to a tax collector, the tension that might have been in that conversation. Like when we sing the song, remember growing up, Zacchaeus was a wee little man. And a wee little man, we didn't sing it quite like that, but how many remember that song? The reason why this is so intense is because Jesus, in that song, when he called Zacchaeus down to sup with him, everybody was thinking, man, that's a tax collector. It was usually a friend who lived right next door who saw your kids get raped or saw your dad get murdered or saw the pain of the community. And now he's betrayed your community and he's gone over to the Romans through a contract to be paid. Like, that's who's there. Tension. So the tax collectors and then sinners. Everybody say sinners. Raise your hand if you know you're a sinner. But what you don't know is what a sinner was then. A sinner then was not someone who was in deeper sin, but it was a class of people. Man, I was reminded of this in Bible school when I learned about this. It's like now we have different classes of people, maybe related to money, a lower class, middle class, upper class. But with sinners, they had a classification, a group of people that they would stamp them as sinners. Who were they? They were the lame. They were the blind. They were the broken down. This is why when Jesus was about to heal someone blind, the disciples said, Jesus, why is he blind? Was it his sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus said neither, because this was very common. If they saw someone who was sick, someone who was distorted mentally or physically, they would always just try to throw out, oh, it must be the sin that he's involved in or she is involved in. Also prostitutes and adulterers, all classified as sinners. It was literally like a documentation. You're a sinner. Like, we stamp you from the religious community. But then also, so you had the sinners in the crowd, you had the tax collector in the crowd, but then you had the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. The Pharisees, they were not like you. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you they were better than you. If works is how you measure someone, they had you beat. First of all, let's just start with the Torah. They had the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, memorized. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Memorized. They didn't just read through it. How many of you have set out at the beginning of the year and say, I'm going to read through the Bible this year? Raise your hand, okay? But then when you get to Leviticus, it's like, okay, I'm going to go to James. I love that brother James. Okay? They didn't just read through it. They had it memorized. And then when they would see a command, a law, they almost aced it. They just were really into works, but there's just no way you can keep that. And Jesus said, if you're guilty of breaking even one of the laws, you're guilty of breaking them all. So in their eyes, because they got really close, and because they would hid the word acharit, they would hid the sin that they had and would not admit it. They really thought that they were self-righteous, like they were ready for God anytime he wanted to be around them. Well, the truth of the matter is, they did get close. In fact, they even added to the law. One particular one they added is that, and I was reading about this, that how many of you have a Fitbit or an iWatch? It keeps track of how many steps you take. Well, they didn't have that, as you can imagine. But they would keep track on the Sabbath of how many steps, and they wouldn't go over like 100 steps on the Sabbath because they would consider that working. They added that. Like there wasn't enough rules in Leviticus. And then they even added that you can't drag a chair across the floor over 3 feet because it would leave grooves in the ground and it would be considered plowing. Like, who are these people, man? So that was also some people in the group. So you have to just see that these are misfits. I mean, you have all kinds of people. You have the cripple, you have the blind, you have people with diseases, you have hookers, you have adulterers, you have robbers, haters, distorted people mentally and physically. You have the arrogant religious people. Hey, this looks like the church to me. So can we learn from it? So I'm going to read the story now, but I want you to see it through the eyes of everyone around, because there was times where the religious people were going, whoa, Jesus is on. He's getting ready to expose them. And then there are other times where he would flip it and he would speak directly at the religious people. Point in case is that the Lord loves to speak where we're off track. And we're always off track, but the big theme in this is grace. Like, he wants you around. You can see with both sons who made huge mistakes that he wanted them home. So in Luke chapter 15, verse 11, Jesus continued. This is after teaching the other two parables, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost sheep. Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them, and not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And when he came to his senses, and this is what the Lord would want us all to do, just to realize life is best with the Father. That's coming to your senses. All of hell just has one goal in mind, and that is to keep you from going home to the Father. So he came to his senses, said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I'm going to set out, go back to my father and say to him, I'm going to come up with this speech, maybe it'll work. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son. Let's hold it. Now, what I've always said is when that son was going home, he's trying to, man, I'm just going to try. I got to try. I miss my dad. I'm going to go home. I'm hungry. And the father saw him and started running out to him. He didn't know the father had compassion at that time. In fact, I've noticed when people are gone from the father a long time, they forget about his love. When he saw the father chasing him down, he's probably saying, the father's going to kill me. He's coming right at my face. But the father just wanted to be with him. You can see it now in the story. So when he was a long ways off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Look, it's scary to have those big conversations. I remember when I asked Michelle's dad if I could marry Michelle, I was so nervous. Chase, I couldn't hardly breathe. I was stuttering. I was trying to remember my talking points. I finally just said, can I marry your daughter? He said, when? It's like, oh, okay. He doesn't really like this idea. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And by the way, this reminds me of times when I was in trouble, like when I would come home partying too much in high school and just trying to sneak into my house. And my dad would see me, son, what are you doing? And I'd just stand in there like wobbling and just looking at him, I'm not doing anything. Son, where have you been? I was at a Disney movie or whatever, just whatever. Look at the rest of this. And by the way, remember the audience. The Pharisees at this point are still thinking, preach it, Jesus. You're not so bad. And the sinners are thinking, I'm so unclean. But the father said to the servant, quick, bring the best robe, put it on him. Religious people are going, what are you talking about? Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. See his feet, they're all beat up. He hadn't had shoes. Get him some shoes. Bring the filet mignon, the fattened calf, and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. You know, I've been a dad and now I'm a grandfather. And this seems a lot more like a grandfather than a dad. Like, all I remember in the first 18 years of raising my kids, I just said no every day to everything. No. Dad, can I? No. Dad, everybody? No. But as a grandfather, you just is different. I had a time with Jack on Monday this week, and all the flood stuff, everything's happening, and we just decided to get away. So I took him to get a haircut, and I said, where you want to go now, Jack? He said, golfing. I said, you are the one. And so I took him out there, and we're hitting balls like, we only hit like 10 shots because he's 2 years old. And he just wants, there's a bug, let's watch it. There's an air conditioning, let's go look at the air conditioning. Like, what? But I didn't care. My sons, I would say, hit another shot right now. That's why they hate golf. But Jack, what do you want to do now, Jack? I want to go to the splash pad. All right, let's go. What do you want to do after this? So Jack goes, I want ice cream. Well, do you want it from Chick-fil-A or do you want it from an ice cream store? Ice cream store. So I took him to an ice cream store, which is basically a restaurant with a menu that said ice cream on it. But it's 12 o'clock lunch. And I didn't make him eat anything but ice cream. Like, what do you want, Jack? You want some food? Ice cream? Do you want some broccoli first? Like my sons, I made them eat broccoli first. No, hate broccoli, want chocolate ice cream. Okay, bring the chocolate ice cream. Don't judge me. The beautiful thing about a grandkid is they don't eat all the ice cream. Yeah. So it's like a grandparent. So verse 25. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. Like, this is a party of parties. So he called one of his servants and he asked him what was going on. Your brother's come in. And your father has killed the fattened calf, you know, the one you've always wanted. Because he has him back safe and sound. And the older brother became furious, angry. Now remember, the religious people are hearing this. And he refused to go in. So his father went out. So here's going, this guy's like a victim mentality. I mean, look what he tries to do to destroy, like, to mess everybody up. I'm just not going in. It's just ridiculous. I'm not going to the Father. This is what a religious mindset can do to you. Listen, we all need the grace, and you're never going to go home until you like the grace and want the grace and love the grace. So the father goes out and pleaded with him. You would have thought the father went out and slit his throat. But he went out and he pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Remember the religious people? Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, he didn't even mention brother, who has squandered your property with prostitutes. Now remember, the sinners are sitting around. There's prostitutes around here, possibly when Jesus was telling this. When he comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, man. And everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead. Now here it says brother. He was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Look, the Father will do anything that He can to get you back to the house. Look at what He did. He took it all. He was saying, this is my turn, my robe, my house, my ring, my grace, my love, my filet mignon, my band, my music. This is where I want you to be. I just want to embrace you again. I was hearing my friend Jonathan Stockstill this week. He was talking about his daughter who was at church. And when she was at church, they got in a car to go home. And she said, Dad, during church, I heard God speak to me. And he was like, turn the radio down, like, what? What do you mean? She said, Dad, I've never heard that before, so what did He say? Daddy, He told me to worship Him my entire life and to never stop. And so now they're just having this moment. I'm going to tell you right now, you can buy your kids incredible things. You can give them the best coach in softball and baseball. You can sign them up for being tutored in the academic world. Go for these things. But I'm going to tell you, the greatest reward as a dad is one of your kids hears the voice of the Father saying, I want you home. It's in church where someone hears, I still love you. I still want to give you a chance. So thankful that when my kids look at my life, that they somehow remember the grace more than they remember my mistakes. I'm convinced that it has something to do with Jesus. My daughter, Grace, when she was younger, she was sick. She had a thyroid problem. We didn't know what it was, and so she's fine now. But for about a year, 6 months, I don't know how long it was, maybe 3 months, we didn't know. And so her hair was falling out and her skin was dry. And she was so sick and lethargic. And so I would sit her in my lap and she would look at me and she said, Dad, don't worry, I'm going to be okay. It's like, oh, I'm not worried. She goes, yes, you are, Dad. She goes, Dad, I bet you can't stare at me without crying. And I was like, yeah, I can. And she would touch it. See, Dad? It's wet, Dad. That's a tear. You can't do it. I'm going to tell you right now, if you're not a father in this place, there's no way you would ever know what a phone call just to say, hey, Dad, I love you. I just want to let you know I don't always show it that way, but I do. And I just want to make sure that you know it is very important to me. There was this son who was sick. I was reading about this years ago. And he was around 10 years of age, and his dad was a man of God. And so he had to check on his son to make sure he was right with God, because this was it. So he walked into the room, and he said, son, I just need to ask you a question. I know you're not feeling good, but I just want to know, son, if you were to die today, are you ready to meet the Lord? And the son, who didn't understand theology, he just looked at his dad and he said, Dad, all I know is if God is anything like you, I'm ready to meet the Lord. I just want to encourage you, come on, men. Whoever's in your household, no matter how fragmented your home might be, before you get that call, maybe you need to call your child. Apologize for a mistake or two. Pray with them. But if you still have your family in your house and your kids are still being raised, let them know that your countenance is for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Like we're getting up, we're going to church. We're getting in the Word. And we're going to serve the Lord all the days of our life, because one word from God can change a person forever. In Jesus' name. Amen. Let's bow our heads, please. No one looking around.